Hello, this is my presentation, Joseph Sheridan Fanu's Occult Animals, which is part of work in progress that I'm currently doing for a chapter that I'm writing, and I would very much welcome any questions, any thoughts, any ideas, either on my email or on Twitter. Do feel free to contact me anytime. Animal life, and I'm defining it broadly as including both animals and birds, features heavily in Fanu's fiction, including in his very well-known collection In a Glass Darkly. So in Carmilla, we encounter Carmilla shape-shifting into a cat, where Laura says, I quote, "I soon saw there was a sooty black animal that resembled a monstrous cat." In the other very often critically analysed story in the collection In a Glass Darkly, Reverend Jennings is haunted by a monstrous demonic monkey spirit. It is described as a small black monkey pushing its face forward in mimicry to meet mine being Reverend Jennings's own account of his experience of this demonic monkey spirit. Also in the collection The Familiar, we find an ill-omened bird, which is an owl, by the side of Barton's corpse once he has been potentially murdered by the spirit that haunts him. So as the door yielded to his pressure, the ill-omened bird, of which the servant had been in search, uttering its spectral warning, started suddenly from the far side of the bed. But also beyond the collection In a Glass Darkly, we do still find animals and birds in Fanu's fiction, such as in Stories of Lough Guir, where, for example, a magician shapeshifts into a gigantic vulture. So with heavy winnowing wings, the gigantic vulture rose in his stead and swept round and round the room as if on the point of pouncing upon her. Also in Squire Toby's will, Charlie is haunted by a probably supernatural bulldog, which is first described as a strange dog in front of the house, a white dog with a black head. One thing that these animal apparitions tend to have in common is that they appear in circumstances where we wouldn't expect them. They are uncanny apparitions which point to the supernatural. With Carmilla, it's absolutely clear, but also we know in Squire Toby's will that the bulldog appears after Charlie cheats his brother out of his rightful inheritance, and that is probably familiar, if not an embodiment, of his deceased father's spirit. These animals always appear in the proximity of death, in the proximity of the supernatural, which looms threateningly over the mundane life which the characters know. What is interesting to notice as well is that these animals tend, broadly speaking, to fall into two categories. On the one hand, we have animals generally closely associated with the domestic space, animals which we always find close to human beings, such as, for example, the dog in Squire Toby's will. We know that dogs are considered man's best friend. They're a friendly creature usually, so there's an added layer of uncanniness when encountering a dog or even a cat, which is also often associated with the domestic sphere, although with the added association with witchcraft from folklore that we know. So we have on the one hand the domestic animals, the animals associated with the domestic sphere, and on the other hand we have animals, generally actually birds, which are more closely linked to variously embodied bad omens. The vulture, a scavenger, is obviously often associated with death, decay, corpses. On the other hand, the owl is often a symbol of wisdom, but also, especially in Celtic lore, it is a symbol of the underworld, but also very much associated with death itself. For example, in Welsh, the screech owl is actually known as the corpse bird. So we have two different categories of animals and or birds, but pointing in that same deathly, uncanny, sinister direction. So one of the questions that naturally arises is, how do we read these spectral animal presences which haunt Le Fanu's fiction and his protagonists? And one of the instances of spectral animals which has attracted a tremendous amount of critical attention is the demonic monkey which torments Reverend Jennings in the tale Green Tea. And it has garnered so much critical attention that, to quote Jarlath Colleen, while the ingenious Dr. Hesselius can only come up with a couple of potential explanations, scholars have posited about 30 and counting, ranging from the Victorian crisis of faith to colonial guilt to repressed homoerotic desire, end quote. However, as Colleen further points out, other critics have drawn attention to the fact that potentially this is the wrong critical path to take, and that rather Le Fanu might be intentionally leaving us in, and I quote again from Colleen, interpretative dark, end quote. To Richard Haslam, however, the crux of Jennings' haunting resides in the idea that he has convinced himself he is a reprobate in Calvinistic theology. So in Calvinistic theology, predestination plays a crucial role. So that means that Jennings has convinced himself that he has been destined to eternal damnation, and the vision of the monkey is an affirmation or a confirmation of that theological fact. Hence, in Haslam's view, Jennings's despair, Jennings's theological despair, stems not from his loss of faith, but rather, to quote, from a shattering new perspective on it. He has come to believe he is a reprobate, end quote. This growing conviction of reprobation, which Haslam argues is developed through what he calls Le Fanu's trademark technique of gradual transition from the trifling to the terrifying, that was a quote, is related to Reverend Jennings's reading of the theology of the occult Emanuel Swedenborg. So what I want to argue in this talk is that Le Fanu's occult animals tend to inhabit a theological space at the intersection of a Swedenborgian symbolism and underlying Calvinistic assumptions, which ultimately tend to demonstrate to his protagonist the reality of an afterlife, but always to fall back onto the materiality of the world. So now I want to dwell a bit on the Swedenborgian symbolism underpinning some of the animal apparitions in Le Fanu's fiction. So Swedenborg draws a distinction between nature and life. Nature, he argues, is that which derives from the natural world as implied in its very name. So to illustrate, he says that nature, the beginning of nature, derives from the sun of the world, and he uses a small s to refer to the sun of the world. However, life traces its beginning to the Son of Heaven, and at this point Swedenborg capitalizes the S for sun. That means that life bears in itself the principle of divine creation, however nature refers strictly to the material form. And it is this distinction that leads Swedenborg to contend that nature in itself is lifeless. That means that its only purpose is to clothe the spiritual. So the principle of life, that spiritual force animating everything that exists within the world, finds itself enmeshed or clothed, to use Swedenborg's own term, in the material form of everything that we see and that we perceive through all the senses within the material world. Hence, he says, the beings as well as things which inhabit the world usually point to a spiritual reality. When looking at beings such as animals, for example, Swedenborg contends that the forms of animals in the world are always determined by spiritual substances and forces. The way the animal form is shaped is a manifestation of these spiritual forces, which ultimately point to the first origin, which is God. So, to quote from Swedenborg, the animal form derives the impulse to the production of such parts, by which he means organs and senses. It's being human from the first origin of all things, which is God. And he applies this to both humans and animals. So there is this connection between the two, both residing within a material form, which is a manifestation of that life, of that creative divine impulse towards which it is ultimately directed. At the same time, Swedenborg argues there is to each thing a literal and an inner meaning. The literal meaning corresponds, in a sense, to nature. It is that which we can see, the form, the physical shape of a thing. And the inner meaning is that occult hidden truth, which we can access through enlightenment, and which is clothed in that physical form, in that literal meaning of thing. Unsurprisingly, biblical symbolism is very important to Swedenborg, and he often uses images, symbols of birds and animals to uncover truths about the divine. In his writings on regeneration, he actually uses the images of owls, vultures, as well as satyrs, to reflect on the nature of the carnal passions. He writes about human cravings dancing around in the manner of owls and vultures. And to overcome this type of carnal cravings is not an easy process. In fact, Swedenborg argues it takes a lot of time and a lot of self-determination. This process is in a way akin to moving away from the literal meaning of things and towards the inner meaning of things, towards an understanding and uncovering of that hidden occult truth. But it's always that physical, natural form that pulls us back into its own prison. So when in Stories of Lough Guir, in the section The Magician Earl, the magician undergoes a series of transformations, what he is doing, in a way, he is uncovering the multiplicity of his own inner meanings. So the gist of the story, for those of you who don't know it, is that a magician tells his wife that she can witness his craft so long as she can keep silent and not say anything to anything that she might witness. And he goes through a series of shape-shifting transformations, including into a hideous vulture. At the moment of his transformation into a vulture, the wife manages to keep silent. However, just as he seemingly morphs back into himself, his own human form undergoes a horrific transformation, whereby, and I quote, he then placed himself at his length on the floor and began to stretch himself out and out longer and longer until his head nearly reached to one end of the vast room and his feet to the other. So from a Swedenborgian lens, we can read the magician's transformation into a vulture as him working through his cravings or his carnal passions. That is to say, in taking on the form of a vulture, in taking on symbolically the form of his craving, he can sort of try to move forward away from that literal meaning and towards an inner meaning of his own being, which he would normally achieve once he has shapeshifted back into himself, back into his human form, having been formed and having been enlightened by this series of transformations, which would help him understand his own inner meaning by making the symbolical physical, by actuating that inner hidden meaning through the actual animal form. At the same time, once he resumes his human form, it seems as if he has been tainted by those series of transformation, because he's this strangely elongated form of his own self, which actually triggers the horrified scream from his wife, thus causing both of them to incur a curse. It seems as if the magician has not emerged unscathed from his own series of physical transformation, which explore the inner meaning of his own self. His new human form seems to have been contaminated with the animal form. His coiling human form now bears the imprint of all those inner cravings, because he has not emerged from that process, which Swedenborg talks about, the process of moving away from the flesh. At this stage, the process has not been completed. His ontological status is now reminiscent of Geoffrey Jerome Cohn's thesis 3 of his monster thesis, where he talks about the monster as being the harbinger of category crisis, describing the bodies of monsters as describing monsters as disturbing hybrids whose externally incoherent bodies resist attempts to include them in any systematic structuration. Shape-shifting speaks very closely to this idea of hybridity and of resistance in front of any kind of categorization. And this sense of resisting categorization is also transposed into the magician's newly formed human shape. Although his wife managed to contain her horror while he was undergoing these series of transformation, including into the animal form of the vulture, she can no longer contain it when he reassumes his human form, but in this elongated, distorted shape. That is because there is a sense of movement between that inner meaning and the literal meaning. The magician is now a hybrid being, a hybrid body, and the inner reality clothed within his hybrid body, if we are to read it from the point of view of Geoffrey Jerome Cohn's monster thesis, is in a sense a monstrosity itself, an ontological monstrosity. So the magician's newly formed human shape points to its containing an ontological monstrosity within that literal shape which it assumes. The use of the elongated body emerges as a trope in Fanu's fiction, as apart from his employment of it in Stories of Lough Guir, it also appears in Carmilla when she shapeshifts into the cat, and Laura describes it as, I quote, "I soon saw that it was a sooty black animal that resembled a monstrous cat. It appeared to me about 4 or 5 feet long, for it measured fully the length of the hearthrug as it passed over it, and it continued toing and froing with the lithe, sinister restlessness of a beast in a cage," end quote. And also it is employed in Squire Toby's will as a means of suggesting that the material is pointing towards a deeper inner reality. The technique of using distorted material physical shapes to point towards a theological reality is not new, and we encounter it, for example, in icons, where stylized faces, stylized bodies are meant to show the higher spirituality of the beings depicted. And it is also something that we encounter in El Greco's art, where he is famous for painting elongated figures, an elongation which speaks to Le Fanu's own use of the trope. In their reading of El Greco's painting style, Martinez Lough Guir et al. Talk about the clear existence of two different planes in his paintings, one higher, spiritual, and one material and lowly, which again parallels that Swedenborgian vision which we encounter in Le Fanu's fiction. El Greco's elongated figures, Martinez Lough Guir et al. Point out, are intentional, and they are due to, I quote, aesthetic and expressive considerations intended to increase the spirituality of the figures, end quote. We know from his treatment of extreme chiaroscuro in Shark and the Painter that Le Fanu was interested in painterly techniques adapted to fiction in order to point towards these deeper presences which can inhabit the material. These hybrid elongated bodies then show the contamination of the material form with a deeper spiritual reality. Discussing Captain Barton's haunting in The Familiar, Zoe Lemon-Imfeld points out that the haunting is a confrontation with the, I quote, imminent presence of the ghost, which ultimately reveals Captain Barton's actual condition, end quote, to himself. That means that when faced with these hauntings, Le Fanu's characters are reframed as theological beings. That is to say, it becomes clear that the material is not simply material, but that it is, in fact, inhabited by an inner meaning. However, and this is characteristic of Le Fanu, as many critics have noted, we are never shown what that actual meaning is. We are never given a full sense of revelation, the material always falling back onto itself in a kind of vicious circle where this distortion of the physical form shapes towards a deeper spirituality. This distortion, this elongation of human animal bodies point out to that same increase in spirituality which Martinez Lough Guir et al. Attribute to El Greco, but then it never points out to that actual truth which is hidden within, always falling back onto the materiality of things, always falling back onto nature rather than life. And within this kind of negotiation between Swedenborgian nature and Swedenborgian life, a sense of horror is always born. To conclude then, I want to turn back to Richard Hadlam's reading of the horror of Reverend Jennings' haunting in Green Tea as his realisation of his own reprobation in Calvinistic terms, and suggests that what Le Fanu's occult animals do is to theologically weave together Swedenborgian occultism with underlying Calvinistic presuppositions, whereby a spiritual reality is hinted at, but the inner truth is never uncovered, never managing to break through what Alison Milbank has called a barrier. While Le Fanu's characters realise that there is a higher spiritual reality out there, they ultimately fall back onto their own reflection, and what is revealed, if anything at all, is a sense of what Captain Barton in The Familiar has called a dreadful God. This is because in the impossibility of breaking through that barrier, what is reflected is ultimately that same human condition which is always infused with the sense or the fear of reprobation that overarching fear of ultimate damnation. Thank you.